I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com, and this is the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, June 21st, 2014. We are going to war. I find that thought to be shocking and am dismayed to find that few see it or don't care. Have we lost our minds? In a word, yes. Part of the problem rests at the feet of something that I wrote about this week, the fourth turning. Our great-grandfathers died before we were born, and we didn't listen much to our grandfathers, all of which means that we get to repeat the mistakes of our great-grandfathers and start the process all over again. Unfortunately, this fourth turning includes nuclear and biological weapons, and that spells doom for America. Why does this mean doom? Because America has backed Russia into a corner and hasn't given her an acceptable escape route. Such a cornered opponent will go for the only option that leaves them with any chance of survival: nuclear weapons. If you think that I'm engaging in hyperbole, you have not been paying attention to events in Ukraine, Syria, or the ex-Soviet Republic of Georgia. To quote Jim Quinn of theburningplatform.com, our situation is a, quote, powder keg and the politicians are acting like slow-witted monkeys lighting matches. Jim Quinn, the fourth turning accelerating. Of course, Jim was referring to the 102 million unemployed workers in the U.S., but we're actually talking about the same thing. Our difficult economic circumstances, coupled with our penchant for repeating the mistakes of the past, well, they are driving us hell-bent for war. What was it that helped drive Rome to her knees? That great mass of unemployed Romans that we call the Roman mob, that demanded bread and circuses. How did Rome deal with this problem? They went to war to plunder everyone else to pay for their bread and circuses. Sound familiar? Welcome to the end of the world as we know it. Enjoy your stay. Are you going to be ready for this? That's a link. Do more than think about it. So, what did we talk about this week? This week we talked about ISIS hysteria and how it impacts the prophecy in Isaiah 17. We discussed Strauss and Howe's implications of our place in the fourth turning and how we are rushing towards a horrifying rendezvous with destiny. And when we reach that predestined point in time, most of the cycles that I have been talking about collapse, and we enter an age of apocalyptic war. So let's talk about that. On Monday, it was another research day, so we jumped to Tuesday. And on Tuesday, it was ISIS hysteria and Isaiah 17. When I first heard about ISIS, they seemed like the kind of Muslim extremist group that we've seen before. As they cut their way into Iraq, that view hasn't changed. This is an irregular militia of light infantry without air support, and they are fighting poorly trained and poorly organized military forces that were not defending what they considered to be their own territory. Furthermore, there's a limit to how much area that 10,000 men can control, as the Kurds so amply demonstrated when they recently captured Kirkuk. This means that ISIS isn't the threat that the mainstream media would like you to believe, at least not yet. Hysteria always makes me uncomfortable. It can be used to discredit us and gives our opposition the opportunity to do his dirty work, and we are the most easily manipulated when we are at our most hysterical. Of course, there are situations where hysteria is warranted. For instance, the destruction of the United States and Ezekiel's fire is coming, and that is worth quite a bit of hysteria, if that is what gets you off of your couch and onto a plan for doing something about it. However, these ISIS guys, or the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, aka ISIL, are not worth the effort. They are just a well-trained bunch of thugs with a lot of morale while being well supplied with weapons. Well supplied with weapons. How could a ragtag group of ruffians like ISIS come up with the training, weaponry, and supplies to do what they are doing in Iraq? Well, you just need to follow the money. And that trail ultimately leads to the Saudis. They are the paymasters for the war in Syria, and they are paying the salaries for ISIS. And when the person who signs your check tells you to do something, well, you do it. So when you see these ISIS militants engaging in military operations in Iraq, You just need to ask yourself what Saudi Arabia stands to gain from all of this. So what do the Saudis gain from this raid on northwestern Iraq? And yes, I call this a raid because we have yet to see whether ISIS can consolidate their hold on the territory that they have taken. Well, there are a number of reasons why the Saudis might want ISIS to take control of a large chunk of Iraqi territory. They want to still keep the possibility of an Iran-Iraq-Syria natural gas pipeline dead. They want to deny the Iranians an overland route for the resupply of Syria. They want to weaken the Iraqi Shiite government in Baghdad. And anything that causes trouble for Iran, well, it's a good thing in the eyes of Saudi Arabia. For the moment, I doubt that the Saudis are attempting to do more than the above. There has been some talk of an attempt to split Iraq up, and that will probably happen, but I'm not sure that this is the main focus. By the way, the article that got me thinking about all this was The War Nerd Here's Everything You Need to Know About Too Extreme for Al-Qaeda ISIS. It's a pretty good article, even though he misses the big picture. The problem is that the recent dramatic successes of ISIS might bring more fighters under their banner, and it might give them some legitimacy in the eyes of the residents of northwestern Iraq. We'll see. For us, this is just one more step in the direction of the destruction of Damascus and the fulfillment of Isaiah 17. Quote, "The burden of Damascus, behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap." Isaiah 17:1. Damascus is one of the most ancient, continuously inhabited cities in the world. But when Damascus is destroyed, over the next few years she will no longer be able to make that claim. Worse, the rest of Isaiah 17 speaks of a destruction reaching out into Jordan and Israel, which will horrify us all. On Wednesday, it was eventually people wake up, the fourth turning. We all love a good story, the bigger the better. We talk about how good we are, how great our society is, and we hire storytellers to give us those stories. Our storytellers talk to us from the television and radio. They write the stories in our newspapers, magazines, and books. We send our children to school to learn the stories. We go to churches that tell us the stories we want to hear. And we put our best storytellers in government. But there comes a moment in time as people start to wake up that the storytellers send us to war. I find the lies that we tell ourselves to be utterly fascinating. They are literally everywhere, and we pass them on to others. We love our lies, and we don't like it when people take them away from us. Even a cynical guy like me has his favorite lies, and the past 3 years has been a painful process of disillusionment, as I had one lie after another ripped away. I find myself grateful that God has put up with me and my foolish illusions for so long. Why is it that we love lies so much, when we know that the consequences for harboring them are so completely awful? People would rather give up their reward in heaven and even spend an eternity in hell, rather than acknowledge the truth. Amazing. We even lie about God. I get them all the time. They usually start out like this: God would never fill in the blank. When I pull out the Bible and show where God said that he would do such and so, I either hear deafening silence or an observation that this isn't the God that they believe in. And I'm afraid that they're right. Those who willingly believe in lies do not worship the same God that I worship. Please remember that your lies won't save you. Worse, they will kill you. Take this video for an example, and I included in the article, and it's called "How Do You Kill 11 Million People" by Andy Andrews. How do you kill 11 million people? You lie to them, and you get them to tell the lies to each other. There's another angle to this subject. It's a video titled "How Do You Kill 11 Million People?" and it's also in the article. Focus your attention to the last minute and a half of the above video. Here's a link to the post that I am talking about. I provided in the article. It asks the question, why do all these civilizations follow the same identifiable sequence? from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back into bondage. Go back thousands of years and you will see the same pattern, and the answer to the above question is that we like the lies that people tell us, and we teach these lies to each other. But a moment in time always comes when the lies don't work anymore, when the lies become just too grotesque to swallow. When that happens, your government takes you to war. When you measure the distance from the peak of one major war to the peak of the next one, you'll find that it's almost always around 80 years. It was 82 years from the peak of the American Revolution to the peak of the U.S. Civil War. It was 81 years from the peak of the Civil War to the peak of World War II. It was 81 years from the peak of World War II to the peak of what would you think will come around 2025 to 2035? Could it be the Great Tribulation? Yes, I'm afraid that William Strauss and Neil Howe were onto something when they published their book, The Fourth Turning in American Prophecy, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. What's even more incredible is that they published the book in 1997. We really are in a rendezvous with history, but I'm afraid it won't be a good one. David Knight of Infowars.com gives a pretty good and quick summary. I include the video in the article, and it's titled, The Coming Crisis and Revolution is a Fourth Turning. What got me started on this idea was a link from Steve Quayle's website to an article called Fourth Turning Accelerating. That article by Jim Quinn is excellent, and I recommend that you read it. It is yet another hammer blow to the lie that everything is going to be fine. Things are not going to be fine, and the only hope that you have is to hold God close, move away from ground zero, and brace for impact. Are you ready for this? On Thursday, it was this horrifying rendezvous with destiny. Yesterday, I wrote about Strauss and Howe's book, The Fourth Turning in American Prophecy. Its subtitle is What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. I don't think that William Strauss or Neil Howe really understood what that rendezvous with destiny is. In fact, I'm not completely sure that I even do. This rendezvous is shaping up to be the most horrifying moment in human history since the Great Flood, and few of us really see it. The fact that it didn't have to happen this way adds frustration to this feeling of alarm. We didn't need to choose this path, but we chose it anyway, and our children pay the highest price. There is a certain inevitability to this train wreck that we call the near future. We always forget, and we never pay attention. Even if our grandfathers and great-grandfathers were around to tell us that we were on the same well-trodden path of their fathers, well, we wouldn't listen. I distinctly remember my grandfather talking about how important gold was and the foolishness of the stock market, and it took me 30 years and some painful lessons to realize that he was right. But I'm not sure that he would have been able to help us with our current predicament. He also was caught up in the events leading to World War, and my granduncles went off to fight in Europe and the Pacific without realizing that this was their fourth turning. Could we have avoided World War II? Logic would say yes. Unfortunately, humanity isn't logical. And let's not forget that fundamental problem called sin. Yes, sin. That delicious, self-indulgent rebellion against God is the chief cause of all that's coming. Even you and I, who have been given power over this terrible affliction, are still conquered by it when we aren't paying attention. So we shouldn't be quite so shocked that our unsaved leaders are captured by what even we have difficulty with. I have to keep reminding myself that, but for the grace of God, I would be doing the same thing were I in the same position as our foolish leaders. If you disagree, you clearly don't know me very well and haven't taken a good hard look in the mirror lately. The fact that God sacrificed his only son for such foolish sheep as we, well, it's beyond my understanding. Just don't let your difficulty in comprehension keep you from accepting what God has offered. If you have not accepted Jesus' sacrifice for your sins, do it now. If you don't know what that is, find out now. If you don't know how, just ask God. He's right there and ready to show you the way. Do not delay. Now let's see, where was I? Ah, yes, our rendezvous with destiny. Please remember that it is our leadership that leads and pushes us towards what is coming. It's nothing terribly supernatural, it's just about money, although Satan is involved. Paul speaks of the love of money being the root of all evil in his first letter to Timothy, and I'm afraid that he's right. Look at any dreadful situation caused by humanity, and you only need to follow the money to find out who was the chief cause. It's all about money. All of it. So it shouldn't be a surprise when you see this awful headline in the New York Times. The lack of major wars may be hurting economic growth. Wow. What Dr. Tyler Cowen, professor of economics, is saying in that evil article is that we need to go out and kill people because our economy isn't doing well. Yes, his language is couched in terms of the neutral observer, but it is no less diabolical. And he is not the only person of uncertain parentage who is making this argument. The fact that it appeared in the Gray Lady of written journalism speaks volumes. If it's in the New York Times, then you know that it's official policy, and that means we are going to war. Greg Hunter of USAWatchdog.com interviewed Gregory Mannarino in a video that I include in the article. It's titled, "Dastardly War Will Prop Up Failing System, Gregory Mannarino." Just before the midpoint of the video, Gregory makes an important observation. Quote, "The United States of America has been involved in more military conflicts than every other developed nation combined, multiple-fold. Why? It's the mechanism. The U.S. dollar, the world reserve currency, needed to be borrowed into existence and then spent. So the propagation of war is paramount with this type of an economic model." Close quote. Ouch. He says that it's the politics of money. And yes, that's his book. On a side note, Mannarino is a trader in the stock market, but he is telling everyone, to buy physical gold and physical silver. He's doing it himself, and I completely agree. If you've done the first things first. The U.S. government is sending us into cataclysmic war. Then it will utterly and completely destroy America and everyone that you care about. And we will let them because we can never seem to learn the lessons of the mistakes made by our great-grandparents, who never learned the mistakes made by their great-grandparents. We have forgotten the suffering and evil of war, so we will allow our leaders to take us to war again, and they will do it for one reason, and one reason only: money. Are you ready for this? On Friday, it was When Cycles Die. Over the last few weeks, I've been talking a lot about cycles that seem to chart the course of human life. It's a pretty counterintuitive idea until you realize that everything in the universe lives according to a certain rhythm. But what happens when the inputs that fuel the rhythm fail? Well, the rhythm, or cycle, dies, and it is replaced by a new one. But what if the owners of the old cycle go to war against the new cycle? Lots and lots of people die. In fact, whole civilizations have died because the old cycle was too successful, which means that they killed off the new one. Look closely at the words in the phrase business cycle. You've heard of it before, and it seems like a fairly innocuous term. Business and cycle? What's wrong with putting the word business together with the word cycle? Well, nothing except the word business represents an entity that needs something to sell that has been manufactured somewhere, unless we're talking about an agricultural product. And you can't have much in the way of manufacturing if 90% of the population are farmers. That was the situation in the U.S. in 1790. Out of a population of 3,929,214 people, only about 400,000 people, or 10%, were available for anything other than farming. And when you subtract the politicians, policemen, postal workers, transportation workers, school teachers, and sanitation engineers, is there anyone left to do manufacturing? Of course not, or at least not very many. There was no business cycle in 1790. What ruled the day was an agricultural cycle that was fueled by the weather. So when did the business cycle begin? Well, the first known use of the phrase business cycle was in 1919, and that's a very interesting moment to start using such a term. Why do I say that? Well, 1919 was almost 50 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it was a long enough time for smart people to realize that there was a pattern to the ups and downs of the sale of manufactured goods. But wait, I said that the fuel for the agricultural cycle was the weather. So what was the fuel for the business cycle? Coal and oil. Now, before we dive into that, let me ask you another question. What fueled the success of the buggy whip industry? Horses. As long as there was a relatively easy supply of horses and a demand for them, there was going to be a demand for buggy whips. And there would have undoubtedly been a certain rhythm to the ups and downs of buggy whip sales. Maybe we could have had an economist develop an idea called the buggy whip cycle. But something killed the buggy whip cycle, and that something was the car. Why do we have cars? Coal and oil. So coal and oil are the fuel, quite literally, of the business cycle. Without it, we go back to being farmers in the agricultural cycle. Are you ready to be a farmer? My wife is, but I fought her off until now, but I won't be able to for much longer if things keep going the way that they are. You see, in 2005, just as predicted, we reached the peak in conventional oil production worldwide. How did we respond? Cheap loans to companies doing fracking. This has worked for a while, but we just had a massive downgrade to the estimates of how much frackable oil there is in the ground. Did you notice that 2/3 of shale oil in the United States just went poof? The shale oil boom in the U.S. just went bust because the Monterey shale reserves in California had been downgraded by a whopping 96%. Here's another problem that you are probably not aware of. For every dollar of oil these frackers get out of the ground, they spend $1.50. And this can only get worse as these fracking companies use up the easiest to get to oil deposits. Furthermore, these frackers exist only because of the availability of cheap loans. When those loans are no longer cheap, what do you think is going to happen? Well, the fracking oil boom will die. Worse, since fracking has been masking the decline in oil production around the world, the collapse of fracking will send a tsunami of asset destruction throughout the U.S. and the world economy. Companies everywhere will collapse. The price of oil is the single most important input to the cost of doing business. The second most important input is the price of coal. Thank God that coal hasn't reached its peak in production yet. What happens to a company when the cost of transportation is too high to ship their goods? What happens when the price of gas is so high that people have to choose between paying the mortgage and putting gas in their tank to go to work? What happens when the price of wheat is too low for a farmer to put fuel in his tractor? What happens to an airline when the price of airfare is too low to buy fuel for their jets? Prices go up, mortgages fail, and companies go out of business. Basically, we are talking about the collapse of our industrial society unless we can find an alternative to our current sources of energy. And we might do that eventually, but we have a problem. by artificially propping up the oil industry, we have delayed the process of discovery for those alternate sources of energy. And, to add a bit of a shiver to our discussion, the 2014 BP Statistical Review just came out a few days ago, and it essentially indicates that the only thing keeping oil production positive was U.S. fracking. Are you starting to feel that we have just run out of time? Yeah, me too. There's a rather awful website that created an interesting picture of what happens when you prop something up that should fail. It's an interesting graph done by an anti-Christian bigot, and it shows the dark ages of what happens when empires collapse. This guy blames Christianity for the problem, but he's completely wrong. The problem comes from how the Roman Empire collapsed. I won't go into all the reasons for it, but suffice it to say that Rome propped up her empire with fake money, cheap loans, an aggressive military, and didn't allow her system to reset. Too many powerful people had too much to lose by a change in the system, so they held on too long, and that killed everything. The result was 1,000 years of darkness. And here we are, doing it again. When our petroleum-fueled economy begins to collapse, what is going to happen to the business cycle? The business cycle will begin to die, and the world will go to war. Are you ready for this? That's a link. Do more than just think about it. I also provide other links to discussions of peak oil in the bottom of the article, and I strongly encourage you to take advantage of looking into those links. This has been the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, June 21st, 2014. I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com.